Hi, everyone. Welcome to a brand new series here on the Svarim Chatter podcast titled Spanish Jewry Through the Ages. I've teased this a couple of times, but we're finally here. And at the time of this recording of the intro, the series is 20 episodes, and it may end up being more. The series is going to start with the origins of the Jews of Spain, and it's going to work its way through the expulsion, and even after that, and I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. But first, I want to give a big thank you, really, to Yidel Gluck and Gluck Plumbing of Lakewood for sponsoring the series. They sponsored the Shopsei Tzvi series, and they've sponsored many other episodes on the podcast. Listeners will be familiar. So I really want to thank them. And again, they're located in Lakewood, but in New Jersey, they have a full service division. So for all your service needs, plumbing service needs, big or small in New Jersey, they have a full service division from boiler changeouts, main sewer line snakeouts, cameraing main lines to a simple faucet leak. Gluck Plumbing Service Division has you covered. So give them a call, 732-523-1836, extension 1. Again, 732-523-1836, extension 1. And I'll put their information in the show's notes, and you can contact them that way. If you need anything plumbing related, please give them a call. Now, a little bit more on the series. So first of all, the series is, as I said, focused on the origins through the expulsion. But the series is mainly focused, it's a kind of a social history. It's mainly focused on the, rather than the Rabbanim and the Svarim and the Gdolim of Spain, which is things that come up, of course, and there very possibly we'll get to recording those, but as of now, that's not what the series, regardless, that's not what the series is focused on, and it's not what I have episodes specifically for. So there will be separate kind of episodes here and there where I may dedicate specifically. So I should talk about programming. The series is going to air on Wednesdays, in Mirza Hashem, separate from the standard Svarim Chatter Sunday episodes. That being the case, there'll be 20 episodes, but however, like I said, there may be a standalone episode. I have a bio of the Ramban or something on the Sefer Chinuch. That will air on a Sunday, which kind of, it's Spain related. They lived in Spain, but it's not exactly part of the series overall. But again, may end up doing things on Sfarim, on the Rishonim, Gdolim of Spain, but that's not specifically the focus of the series. The focus of the series is on Spanish Jewry as a whole, and that's what you'll hear. So to give you a sense of the scope of the series, it's going to start, there's going to be this episode, which is kind of an introductory episode of the origins of Spanish Jewry, kind of until the Reconquista, as it's known, when as you'll hear, Spain was not really the country as we know of it today for a while, so there kind of was Visigoths, and then you have Christian Spain, you have Muslim Spain, the Muslims conquer, and then the Christians kick them out until 1492, which ends up in the expulsion, but we'll get there. But you have the Reconquista, as it's called, when the Christians start reconquering and kicking the Muslims out slowly. So that's kind of where this episode is going to go until first, and then there's going to be another overview. There's going to be, and then, I'm not mentioning every episode now, but there's going to be some few episodes on the riots, the infamous riots of 1391. That really was the beginning of the end for Spanish Jewry. As listeners, you may be familiar with that, or you may not be. You may only know of the expulsion of the Jews in 1492, but you'll learn about the unfortunate riots of 1391. These took place in the Kingdom of Castile, the Kingdom of Aragon. These were different kingdoms at the time in Spain. The series is going to use the word Spain, but it wasn't really Spain as you will see it on a map today. It was the same area, but it's not exactly. It was even at times the Muslim name Al-Andalus, so Iberian Peninsula, regardless of the Iberian Peninsula. So with that being said, we're going to get into, so after those riots, that's really where you have the start of the kind of Marranos, because you had a lot of Jews forcibly converted, besides for being killed. So Marranos, I've used the term conversos on here. You'll hear guests use the term new Christian. You'll hear throughout when we get to those episodes in the series. There's going to be a lot on the Inquisition, the precursor to the Spanish Inquisition and the Spanish Inquisition. You may learn things new that you didn't know, or things that you knew, or various different parts. There's going to be a number of episodes on the Spanish Inquisition, that, real, again, infamous institution that lasted into the 19th century, actually. You'll hear about the Inquisition in South America as well, in Lima in Peru. Then we'll hear about the expulsion and post-expulsion, the Jews of Portugal and their forced conversion. So the expulsion from Spain is in 1492. The Jews of Portugal, then Jews from Spain go to Portugal, and there are Jews in Portugal. Their forced conversion and expulsion happens in 1497. You'll hear about that as well. And then you'll hear kind of, conversos in the Atlantic and in the Americas, and again, the Inquisition in South America, and you'll hear about various different things on that. There's a little bit, I have a little bit about kind of Sephardim post-expulsion. I don't have a lot on that now if listeners have a specific guest or specific something on that, because as we know, the Sephardim today and others, they ended up going all over out of Spain, and they ended up in Turkey and in Syria and in Egypt, and there's those that go to Morocco, and they're all over. So that's kind of, they end up, there's plenty in Italy, and they're all over. So that's something, as well as Israel. So that's something that, and I keep remembering different Salonika and Greece, and they're all over. So that's something that I didn't really do, because I feel like you get this 20 episodes as it is. That's going to just keep going. But I'm open to doing at least one episode broadly to discuss that. Obviously, there's many different things here. There are various parts of Spanish Jewry that we drill down, and there's parts that maybe went even too far, too in depth, and there's parts that I could have gone far more in depth. So you'll get both. And again, Spanish Jewry, many, many important Rishonim come out of Spain. You'll hear them, but obviously we're talking about the Ibn Ezra and the Rambam and the Ramban and the Rashba and the Ran and the Ritva and the Sefer HaChinuch and the Chizdak Kreskas and the Sefer HaIkrim, and I'm jumping all over the place and jumping backwards, the Rif, the Rimigash, the Ritz Gayas, as you know in Yeshiva, or Gayat, and then many more, countless more that I'm forgetting, just mentioning them here. Many more. Just please don't hold me to that. I'm forgetting many just as I'm doing this by heart. So that's not something that necessarily, and Rabbi Levi the Kuzari and from Ibn David, the Sefer Kabbalah. So there's many more that are just not, they could each one have their own episode or series, and there could be a lot done on the Parshanim, on Chumash and the Halacha and Gemara and all that. So that's not something that really is the focus of the series. That could be its own series. And so if you're looking for that and you don't know where that is, that's really why it's not going to be here. But again, I'm still open. I'm still hoping perhaps to do that. If you have ideas, if you have guest ideas, specific things you want to hear regarding that, please email me, nachi@sfarimchatter.com, and we can try to do that as well. So that's really kind of the broad sweep of the series. That's its scope. That's what's going to be going on. These episodes will be released on Wednesday. Again, corporate sponsor, Gluck Plumbing. Thank you. And that's really it. Let me know what you think. Email me, nachi@sfarimchatter.com. I would love to hear your feedback on this. And just in general, also what you think of a series. I have another series already in plan. I know this is 20 episodes. I already have another series that's mostly recorded, 3/4. Already 10 episodes on a different series. So there are more series coming. I know I did the Shops I See. It was a while ago. Didn't get to recording more series. I know I got very good feedback on that, and people liked it. So I would like to do more series. And so there's that. And, I want to mention as well, and got a couple of, I discussed this on this past week's episode, and I got a couple of sponsors, and I thank you to those that did sponsor and advertisers. Sponsors and advertisers, it could be someone just doing illegal Nishmas, just because you appreciate the podcast or because you want to advertise, like Gluck Plumbing. However you want to do it, or you could just do something less. People have sent $18, $20, $25, $36, $50, whatever they can't or don't want to sponsor a whole episode. I'm very appreciative of that as well. There'll be a link in the show's notes to do it via PayPal. You can contact me as well for Zelle. I don't have it yet on this email address, but you can contact me. You can email me again, nachi@sfarimchatter.com, if that's something you're interested in doing. Because again, there'll be regular Sunday episodes coming out. I have some very interesting, standard quote unquote Sfarim Chatter episodes. And one final thing is, if you can subscribe to the podcast, share it with your friends and acquaintances, and also if you can rate it, especially on Apple, and drop a review. So appreciate it. And with that, enjoy this series. It took a lot of time and effort to put together, so I hope you enjoy the series on Spanish Jewry Through the Ages. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Sfarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Professor Jonathan Ray, who is the Samuel Eig Professor of Jewish Studies in the Theology Department at Georgetown University. And he's the author of a number of books, including The Sephardic Frontier, the Reconquista, and the Jewish Community in Medieval Iberia with Cornell University Press, as well as a book on post-expulsion Spain and some others, and a forthcoming book as well, which will get involved in a lot of what we'll discuss here on this episode, which is Jewish Life in Medieval Spain, A New History, which is forthcoming from Penn University Press. And we'll be discussing here Spanish Jewry from its inception kind of until the Reconquista. So perhaps the new book will even go further, but we'll leave that perhaps for a different episode. So thank you, Professor Ray, for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start off. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
So I'm from the New York area originally. I grew up in an Ashkenazi Jewish community and didn't know anything about Sephardic Jews, never met a Sephardic Jew, didn't know what that was. All the Jews I know were the Goldbergs and the Weinsteins, And it was when I went to college as an undergraduate that I took a course on Jewish studies that was focusing on the Sephardic world. And I had my eyes opened. There are Jews named Sasson and Toledano, and they have a very different form of Nusach. They have a very different way of encountering Judaism and a very rich history. And I think for a lot of Jews in the United States, especially on the East Coast, that's news to them, right? So I became fascinated by it immediately. So
from there, I guess you decided that you're going to write and research, and you've written, like I said, a number of books in the beginning on Spanish Jewry. So this is your expertise,
right? This is my area. I had, from another portion of my life, an interest in Spanish. I had lived in Mexico for a while. I lived in Argentina, and so I knew Spanish. I was very interested in Latin American culture and Spanish culture. And I was very interested in Judaism and Jewish culture. And this sort of brought those two parts of my life together very nicely. I taught Spanish in a prep school for many years before I thought, I think I want to go to grad school, do this professionally, and ended up at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. And from then, my career just sort of focused from there on Sephardic history and culture.
Okay, so let's dive right in here. So when we say Spain, Sfarad, what are we referring to? People know the country today, Spain, and there's Portugal, Iberian Peninsula, but what are we referring to? Let's just give an overview, especially of the geography, I guess. I know this will change throughout the centuries as we discuss, but just as an overview to start.
Sure. So generally what I work on is what looks like the country of Spain today in the Middle Ages. And in the Middle Ages, it wasn't Spain yet. It was several different kingdoms, particularly the Kingdom of Castile or Castile-Leon, which is most of the central part of the Iberian Peninsula. The Crown of Aragon, which is on the eastern part of the peninsula, which encompasses Aragon and Catalonia and Valencia. And then the very small Kingdom of Navarre, which is in the Pyrenees Mountains in the north. And a little bit of what is today southern France, what is in Hebrew Provincia or Provence, was attached to the Crown of Aragon for most of the Middle Ages, so that's part of it too. The Kingdom of Portugal, while in many ways related through trade and culture, was an independent kingdom then as it is today. So while I do some work on Portuguese Jews, when we talk about Spain, we're really talking about the Kingdoms of Castile and the Crown of Aragon.
Okay, now the other part of Spain, and we'll get more into, but Muslim Spain. Muslim Spain today, obviously we'll be discussing both. So Muslim Spain, I think it was the Caliphate of Cordoba, right? So discuss there was a bunch of parts of Muslim Spain. So where was that?
Right. So in a nutshell, when the Roman Empire Christianizes, Roman Hispania is most of the Iberian Peninsula, and it is all Christian. When the Roman Empire falls, there are some successor states known as the Visigothic kingdom, etc. These are Germanic peoples who come down from Central Europe and settle in the Iberian Peninsula, and sort of they see themselves as taking over from Rome. Like they see themselves as the new Romans, really. And they rule the peninsula as well as parts of France for a couple hundred years. Then in the year 711, we have these composite armies from North Africa sweep into the peninsula, and they are mostly Muslim in character, and they conquer all the way up into southern France before they're pushed back a little bit into what is known as the Spanish March, which is today Barcelona area in the eastern part of the peninsula. And so when the dust settles there in the early 8th century, much of the peninsula is Muslim, or under Muslim rule, I should say. You have Christians and Jews living under Muslim rule, but they're controlled by these new Muslim rulers. And the part of the northern part of the peninsula, from the Atlantic all to the Mediterranean, is what's left of the Christian Gothic kingdoms. And then slowly, from the 8th through about the 13th century, we have this process known to history usually as the Reconquest or the Reconquista. It's a loaded term because it says, well, Spain is naturally Christian and we're reclaiming it from these Muslim usurpers or invaders. From Muslim history, it doesn't look like that at all, right? This was an area that came under Muslim rule and was under Muslim rule quite fruitfully, culturally and economically, for many, many centuries before, through a variety of different things, the Christians were able to take over. So whether you look at it as a conquest or a reconquest, Muslim Spain is much of the peninsula from the 8th to the 13th century, although slowly there towards the end of that period, they're getting pushed back into North Africa.
Now, even the Muslim Spain, there were also these smaller kingdoms, or was this all one kingdom? What was the kind of geography layout during Muslim Spain kind of throughout the centuries? I know it changed. Sure.
Well, you mentioned the Caliphate of Cordoba, and that comes in a little bit after the conquest. So these conquering armies come in and they set up their own governments in different cities. Eventually, Cordoba becomes the capital, and there's this caliph, or this king who claims himself caliph, right? Calls himself caliph, and somewhat unites the region, lightly unites the region. That unravels after a few centuries, and what is known as the Taifa kingdoms come in. And these are sort of these little princely states, kind of like Renaissance Europe. So we have the city of Cordoba being its own little city-state, and the city of Saragossa being its own little city-state, and the city of Cordoba being its own little city-state. So for much of the time of Muslim rule, you have this light federation of princely states. They're all Muslim, Arabic speaking, though of a mix of Arab and Berber, what we would call today Amazigh cultures. They're from southern Morocco, so they're culturally and ethnically a different Muslim group than Arabs. And these different groups have sort of lightly related principalities, one next to each other in Iberia.
Okay, so, and like I said, well, you mentioned that there's the Reconquista. We'll go kind of in this episode until there, but that's even that, it finalizes, obviously, I'm sure as many listeners know, in 1492, and then the Jews are expelled. So we're not going to go until there, so we'll kind of stop the earlier kind of where it was paused. So let's start now, we gave the background of Spain itself with the Jews of Spain. Where is the Jew? When do the Jews start in the peninsula in Roman times, and then Jews under the Visigothic rules? You mentioned the Visigoths already, and then we'll up until Muslim and then Christian Spain.
Sure. So we don't really know when the first Jews arrived. The Jews are there from earliest times that we have records. So there seem to be Jews living in Roman Hispania, if not perhaps pre-Roman Hispania. So they're always there. And we see them interacting and being fully integrated into Roman life. We have tombstones that talk about Jews being buried here that are using Hebrew language, but also seem to be Roman. We have different, although spotty, records of Jews being part of Roman Hispania, as they were part of the Roman Empire really throughout. So we assume there are trade connections, there's travel connections with the Eastern Mediterranean, with Roman Palestine, etc. We don't have a lot of documentation on it, but the Jews are always there. We begin to get a little bit more information under these so-called Visigothic kings, in part because there are records of them trying to convert the Jews against their will. The notion being to prove their Catholic bona fides. This was a group that were Arian Christians, which is a different type of Christian from Catholicism. When the king converts to Catholicism to prove himself to his Catholic subjects, one of the things he tries to do is, okay, well, all of us are going to be Catholic. The Arian Christians are going to convert, and the non-Christians are going to convert. So there's this push to convert the Jews, not as an anti-Semitic policy singling them out, but to really create a religiously unified kingdom in a particular mold. It seems that the Jews are converted, although that they don't fully begin to practice or leave their practice of Judaism, which causes all sorts of problems. So there's a disconnect on what conversion might mean for the Jews. Look, if you want me to call myself Catholic and go to church, I'll do that. I'm still going to be Shomer Shabbos, right? I'm still going to keep my own Jewish life as much as I can. And so we have these interesting records of the Jews being reconverted several times, which by no one's theology is supposed to happen, right? This is if you're converted, you're converted, and if you're not, you're not. You're not supposed to do this as a do-over 2 or 3 times. So we already, and I bring this up because it's going to be a theme throughout Spanish Jewish history. What do you do if you cross that religious line, but not fully? What happens if Nahi converts and becomes Pablo, but no one in Nahi's family recognizes it? Or no one in the Christian community recognizes it? We still think there's a Nahi in there. We still think he's just a facade of a Christian and he still really sees himself as a Jew. What do I do with him then? Can I keep him as a member of the new community? Do I consider him a member of the old community as a hybrid with a foot in each community? And this becomes a particularly interesting part of the Sephardic tapestry about Sephardic history in the Middle Ages.
Yeah, this is going to, like you said, this goes under the Visigoths, someone under the Muslims, under the Christians. Is there a reason why Spain and these kind of forced conversions? Because we don't find this in other parts of Europe, right? What's going on over here?
Well, we kind of do, but perhaps not on the same scale. So we do have, during the so-called Crusade massacres in Ashkenaz, tales of Jews taking their own life or allowing themselves to be killed, al Kadush Hashem, in order to honor God and rather die a Jew than live as a Christian. But we also have tales of some Jews clearly allowing themselves to be converted and not dying sort of a martyr's death. So we do have examples from different parts, from southern Italy, from southern France, here and there, although not with the documentation perhaps that we do for other parts of Spain, echoes of this problem happening in other parts of Europe and in other parts of the Muslim world. We see some converts in Yemen. Maimonides, the great Jewish scholar, famously writes a letter to the Yemenite Jews talking about how they should stand up to conversion, because it seems to have been a problem in Yemen. So we do have isolated incidents. Part of the problem is we don't always have the documentation that we do for Spanish history, which, for a variety of reasons, there's a lot more preserved about the documentation of medieval Spain than there is of some other areas.
Okay, so now getting back to the Visigothic rule. So there were these kind of forced conversions, but generally, do we know how Jewish life was under the Visigoths until the Arabs, like you said, they come in 711?
We really don't. We really just have little snapshots and have to guess what might it have been like. Interestingly enough, when the Muslim armies come in the early 8th century, there are Jews there. There's discussion of native Jewish communities they encounter there, people living there as Jews. If the Visigoths had converted everyone, how can this be possible? So we begin to ask some interesting questions. Did Jews see themselves as Jews and present themselves that way to Muslims? Were they crypto-Jews, in other words? Did at some point certain members of the community just succeed in escaping the conversions and live openly as Jews, and the Visigoths threw up their hands and let that happen? We don't know. But we know when the Muslims come in, there are people who identify themselves to the Muslims as Jews already there in the Iberian Peninsula. And then, not long after the first wave of the armies, as Middle Eastern peoples begin to flow into Spain, Muslims are followed by Jews. So Jewish immigrants begin to come into the Iberian Peninsula in the wake of Muslim conquest almost immediately. And we have the beginning of another, what I would call, great theme in Sephardic Jewish history, which is tensions or complex relations between local Jews of a place and Jewish newcomers from someplace else. So we know that there are these Latinized Gothic Jews who are not Arabic speakers, who are living in these towns when these Arabic-speaking Jews show up. And they say, oh, well, you're Jewish and we're Jewish. We have this connection. There's a recognition of a shared religious tradition and shared legal demands, but they speak different languages. They come from different communities. The ruling government sees them both as Jews. And the impetus is you guys got to form communities and get along to a certain extent. In other words, they're pushed together by their connection to Judaism as much as by anything. And so we have this interesting thing. We have it in American history as well, where we have German-speaking Jews here, and then the Russian or Polish Jews show up, and they are very often pushed together in some of the similar cities and communities and asked by the majority community to get along.
Okay, so now the Muslims come in, and obviously we're speaking a lot of generalities. We're trying to go to specific parts, but it's overall general, the podcast episode. So what happens then? What is Jew? As you said, there were the local Jews and the Jews that came in. But what was Jewish life under Muslim rule, at least in the beginning? How did the Muslims treat the Jews in Spain?
So again, we get more information as we go on. Those first few centuries, 8th or 9th centuries, are somewhat of a dark ages with information regarding Jewish life. In the 10th century, we begin to get a lot more information, and we can read back what must have been going on before. As best we can tell, Jewish society, much like Muslim and Christian society in the Middle Ages, was something of a hierarchy. Perhaps not a very strict hierarchy as the feudal system was, but still you had Jews who were wealthier, more well-connected, many of them well-educated and well-traveled, and others who almost never left their hometown, were not very well-traveled at all, were artisans. We have a lot of Jews who were weavers and dyers of cloth. Tanners are people who worked with dead animal hides, which was not considered a particularly good job at the time. Jews who were peddlers, so if they were involved in trade, it was really at the lower end of the trade spectrum, bringing small pieces of goods out into the countryside. And some Jews who worked in agriculture, some direct agriculture, very often in viticulture, working with wine, kosher wine, etc. And the life of a Jew who was a very well-educated physician and international merchant and rabbi was quite different from a poor Jewish tanner or cloth dyer. And so you have a ranked or hierarchical community in the Jewish world, as you would with the Muslim or Christian world.
Right. Now, what about any Rabbanim, any rabbis there? I mean, I think the Siddur of Amram Grain was written to Spanish Jewry. I don't know if I'm misremembering that, but...
Well, that's absolutely right. So we have, in the 900s, in the 1000s, we begin to see evidence that Jews in the Iberian Peninsula are connected to some of the great centers of the East, to Yavne and the Palestinian Jewish community, and to Baghdad, and to the Geonim, or the great Jewish leaders of the academies in Baghdad. And so we begin to see, these communications talking about a Jewish community that, for at least its leaders, weren't just provincial, but really were part of a larger world Jewish community, aware of events going on and wanting to be plugged in. We want to pray in the correct way. Can you please, you Geonim there in Baghdad, send us an order of prayers that we may follow these things correctly? Can you send us calendars that can make sure we're on the same page as everyone else? So there's a consciousness of being part of a world Jewish community and wanting to stay in step with that world Jewish community. And that seems to be an impetus coming from the Jews out in Spain. It wasn't that the Baghdadi Jews are trying to grab them and bring them in, but really, at least the leaders of the Spanish Jewish community, I have no idea if the peddlers cared, but the leaders of the Spanish Jewish community wanted to be integrated into the intelligentsia of Egypt, of Syria, of Yavne, like I said, and of Baghdad.
Now, when do we start seeing famous Rabbanim? Obviously, Spain is going to be famous for many, many famous, rabbinic figures. So when do we start seeing the beginning of those?
So the 10th and 11th century, we begin to see that as the Umayyad Caliphate establishes itself, we begin to see Muslim Spain, or Al-Andalus, as it's called, come into its own. and not be some Western province of the Muslim world, but a major center of its own. There's wealth there, and with wealth comes the patronage of literature, of study of the arts, and Jews, the elites at least, who are able to benefit from this connection to an up-and-coming center, do the same in their communities. So we have wealthy Jews in Cordoba and elsewhere underwriting study and creating yeshivot there. So Lucena becomes a town which is known for its great scholarship that draws in scholars from around the Western Mediterranean. In other words, some of these places, Cordoba and Lucena, and to some degree Barcelona, become destinations for young scholars. I want to go study with these great scholars I know live in these places. And once you study with them, some of them stay, some of them go back to their home communities, but keep their connections to their Rav, and create these intellectual networks. So around the year 1000, we see Spain coming into its own. And in many ways, being inspired by Andalusian Muslim intellectuals, right? It'd be hard to imagine here or elsewhere in the medieval world major Jewish intellectual centers thriving in places where there aren't Christian or Muslim intellectual centers, right? Very often these are the inspiration, the competition, right? The impetus for Jewish intellectual creativity.
Right. So that's another thing that I want to explore a little more is before we get back to what kind of regular life, communal life was, just more on this theme for a second, is what were they, who were the Rabbanim here, who were the rabbis here? What were they studying, and how does the cultural, like you said, the Muslim, what was going on in the Muslim world of Spain, where their literary output and interest in the arts and poetry and philosophy, and that's going to be a lot of, there's another episode in this series I did with Professor Ross Brand where I discussed the poetry more in depth, but we can discuss the poetry, the philosophy. I mean, I can mention, listeners are familiar with Yehuda Levi and the Kuzari and Chavis Alvavis Bach and Pekud, and there's many more, Shmuel Nugget. I mean, you can mention a lot more. I'm just, a few names come to mind. There's a lot, and this is what they were involved with at this time in Muslim Spain. So,
sure.
I guess, yeah.
So if we take Shmuel Nagid, or as he's often known, Samuel ibn Nagrela, as an example of the Andalusi Jewish Renaissance man, we get an example of what he or what Judah Halevi represents at that time, and that is someone who feels that to be a true scholar in the world, you have to master not only Jewish texts, but also general knowledge of the time, which included Greek science, from astronomy to medicine to metaphysics, right? Aristotelian philosophy, which has entered into the Muslim world. It's being translated in centers like Baghdad and elsewhere. So we have Sadia Gaon already in the 10th century saying, you have to study Talmud, but you can't ignore the logical sciences of the Greeks as well. A real Jewish scholar is able to dominate both and to show that philosophy proves the truth of the oral Torah, et cetera, et cetera. We see echoes of that Renaissance man beginning to show itself in Al-Andalus. So one of the characteristics of a true Renaissance man is encapsulated by this Muslim term of adab. Adab, which translates as culture, but also just literary culture, linguistic culture. You had to be someone, and this goes really back in many ways to the ancient Greeks, who can use language beautifully and with nuance, both in its written form and its spoken form. You have to be able to stand up in front of your peers and recite poetry or debate them with regard to halakha or philosophy and be convincing in that debate. And so an adib, or a man of letters, was the marker of a true scholar. And you couldn't be that just by studying rabbinic texts. Rabbinic texts were important, they were central to this, but you had to know Arabic, you had to know Hebrew language well. And so there was this notion of a true scholar was someone who was a physician, someone who was a meshiv who wrote legal guidance to his peers, someone who rose up students, someone who knew grammar, someone who knew the various sciences of the time, and a really integrated scholar. Some of these, like Shmuel HaNagid, also found their way into prominence in the Muslim world. So he's a courtier. He's someone who rises to prominence in the Taif of Granada to become the vizier, to become really the prime minister of that state. And so there was an ability, at least for the elites, to have a foot in both worlds without losing their Jewish identity.
So what were the Muslim-Jewish relations like during, again, this broad time period that we're speaking, not a specific part of the, Muslims in Spain, a specific century or a specific place, but in general, actually we'll get to one part where it changed, but until that part, what was the relationship like?
Sure. To understand Muslim-Jewish relations in the medieval world in general, and Al-Andalus falls very much within this general paradigm, you have to understand two things. One is that there's the general law that dictates how majority Muslim community, the Ummah, the world community of Muslims, interacts with religious minorities, what the expectations are. And then you have to understand the social reality, which is really up to who's in power in a particular time and place. So there is a de jure plan in place in which protected peoples, the Aqal Dima, the Dhimmi as they're known, of which Jews and Christians form part in the Muslim world, they're supposed to be treated with a certain level of respect. They're supposed to be given protection by the ruling authorities as long as they fulfill certain things on their end. So there are certain dictates of what they can and cannot wear, what jobs they can and cannot do, how they are supposed to show respect to Muslims, that they're not supposed to build their synagogues or churches higher than mosques, et cetera, et cetera. In reality, as we have in every culture in every country, some rulers are more interested in being tough on crime and some are not. Some are willing to say, we really don't care as long as, relations seem to be good. If Naki doesn't want to wear the clothing he's supposed to wear, I'm not going to get bent out of shape about it. Other rulers will say, I've noticed the Jews are getting a little bit out of line. They're not honoring their part of the contract. And if they don't honor their part of the contract, why should I protect them? That's my part of the contract. And so we see that the dhimmi status of Jews in Al-Andalus can be and is enforced or ignored depending on who's in power in a given time or place. There's a benefit to rulers to go easy on religious minorities and not crack down on them. Religious minorities are very often the only ones a ruler can fully trust because they don't have any designs on the throne. A Christian can't become caliph. A Jew can't become caliph, right? And so they're sort of dependent upon the kindness and protection of rulers in a way perhaps the average Muslim or the ruler's younger brother, right, or someone else in line for the throne isn't. And so there is this odd disconnect. The rulers set themselves up as, I am the ruler of this Muslim community. I am protector of the Muslims, right? I see myself as a good Muslim, but I'm going to hire Jews and Christians as my physicians, as my tax collectors, because I know I can control them in a way that I'm not always 100% sure I can control some of my Muslim subjects.
Right, and you do, although you do get, like you said, they can't become caliph or a king, but you do have in Rishwal Nugget, in Mishaprut, you have the very high positions of power, right? You do get Jews in these
dependent upon their boss, right? right. And we see time and again, Samuel ibn Nagrela, Shmuel HaNagid is a perfect example of this. He rises to the pinnacle of power. He's given the title of general of a Muslim army. He's vizier of a state, and his son is groomed to succeed him. But either times change or his son doesn't have the diplomatic abilities of the old man. Things fall apart quickly under his son Joseph. And not only is Joseph killed, but and this is a disturbing theme we see throughout Al-Andalus and throughout the medieval world, all Jews are blamed for the discretions of, rather the indiscretions of a few courtiers. So if Joseph ibn Agrella is found guilty of rising above his station and cheating and not representing the ruler well, riots are going to take place not against him and his household alone, but against the Jewish community of Granada. And this is what happens. And so we have some Jews rise to very high positions, and there are going to be people in the Jewish community cheering them on. Hey, we got a guy who hangs out with the caliph. And there are other Jews who very nervously say, please don't screw this up, because our necks are on the line the minute you fall out of favor with that Muslim ruler.
Right. Now, things change under the Almohads, and suddenly, so this picks up on what you were just discussing under the Jewish status in the Muslim world. Things suddenly change. When is this, and what happens?
Sure. This is around the late 12th, early 13th century. We already have sort of a paradigm of this in the Bible, right? There became a new pharaoh who knew not Joseph, right? So we have a new guy in charge, the new dynasty that comes in charge. And this particular ruler sees himself as God's chosen one and sees he is going to start a new form of Islam, and all Muslims need to convert to it. This is somewhat echoing what we saw under the Visigoths, right? I'm not only going to have Christians and Jews convert to Islam, even other Muslims have to convert to my brand of Islam that see me as this special anointed figure. If you're a Jew at this time, you're very nervous, because if Muslims who outrank you are going to be forced to change their way of religious practice, you're definitely in trouble. We see Jews forcibly converted, once again, in large numbers. We see Jews killed. We see Jews running for their life. This happens in North Africa, Northwest Africa, as well as Al-Andalus proper in Iberia. And we have these stories of people who escape this area and end up in places like Egypt saying, things are bad out there out west. The days of having a well-placed Jewish courtier at the court helping you out, arguing on behalf of the Jewish community, are gone. These new rulers don't want to hear from it. It's their way or the highway, and Judaism is in trouble in Al-Andalus. Very famously, the family of Maimonides, perhaps the greatest Jewish scholar to come out of Al-Andalus, seems to head out of town at this time too. Interestingly enough, they head into Morocco. They head into sort of the homeland of this dynasty. Most likely, they are acting as outward Muslims during this time. It's not 100% sure, but it's very hard to imagine they could be outward Jews living in the community they did in Morocco at this time. Until such time as they can fully get out of the region, they show up again in Fustat, which is Old Cairo in Egypt, and there they are living openly as Jews. So was there an official moment where he declares himself to be Muslim and then an official moment where he redeclares himself to be Jewish? We don't have that information. We don't. But the experience leaves an indelible mark on him. And we see it in his writings time and again that sometimes in the modern world, we have a view of, well, Christian Spain is the Inquisition, it's intolerant, whereas Muslim Spain is sunshine, and it's Yudah Halevi and poems in Arabic. Not if you read Rambam, right? So if you read the letters and the writings of Maimonides, you see he is scarred by having to been driven out of Spain, probably having to, if not personally, certainly witness forced conversion all around him. And so he writes on questions of forced conversion with empathy and with experience in a way that it's hard to believe he would have if he come from a different region.
Right, and like you said, it's never going to be known, or not never, but it isn't known what exactly happened to him. And as we know, he famously paskins, he says that forced conversion to Islam instead of dying, you're allowed to do. That is something that he does say, so he does paskin like that. So this is, an open question. So as you say, now the Muslims at this time, it's not going well with the Muslim and Jewish relations. So now I guess we should good time to turn over to the Christian kingdoms. And you did mention that even when the Muslims conquered the Iberian Peninsula in 711, there was still Christian kingdoms all the way in the north. So I guess let's go and start, as a parallel, start all the way back there. And what is Jewish life under the Christian kingdom, starting from the 8th century and going up until, I guess, where we were just holding with the Almohads?
Right. That's a great way of putting it. We tend to think there's a Muslim period and there's a Christian period. Even during the height of the Muslim period, where Jews are writing poetry and the first Hebrew grammar book in these Arabic cities of Al-Andalus, there are Jews living in Barcelona under Christian rule. There are Jews living in some of these Christian towns, and they are communicating back and forth, right? And it seems that they all see themselves as part of Sepharad. However loose that community is, it seems that Jews living in parts of the Christian North are seen as part of an Iberian Jewish cultural community shared with the Jews in the South. So if you're an Arabic-speaking Jew or a Romance language-speaking Jew, if you're in the Iberian Peninsula in the 9th and 10th century, you have connections with one another across that political boundary. And you're recognized by the Geonim of Baghdad as really forming a Sephardic cultural community. We have this notion that as the Almohads come in, the Jews flee. Some flee, like Maimonides' family, south, but most flee north. They flee into the Christian communities of northern Spain and of Provence. Very famously, the Ibn Tibbon family, which is a scholarly family from the Granada area, ends up in Provence and sets up a major rabbinic dynasty there and a yeshiva. But in addition to that, they become very well known for using their Andalusi credentials as translators, translating a lot of this learning from Al-Andalus that was written in Arabic into Hebrew for a Jewish reading audience that doesn't know Arabic in Europe.
Yeah, they're the ones who translate Rambam's works, right? Pirush Mishnayos, Mar Nevuchim, Yudah Levi's Kuzari, Chavis Halvavis. They're just translating all these works that we have today. We still have their translations. There are new translations today, but that's where they really translate a lot of these works. So talking about Christian Spain, you mentioned all the way in the beginning that there are different kingdoms, but just in general, what is the Christian Spanish culture like, and how does that differ from Muslim Spain, which it does, and then how does that affect the Jewish communities in Christian Spain versus in Muslim Spain?
Sure. I'm going to start with how they're similar, actually. In this period, and we're talking about, let's say, the 11th, 12th, early 13th century, some of the similarities are that the Jews are considered a marginalized group in Christian Spain because of their religion, right? There is no dhimmi status officially in the Christian world, but essentially you're Christian or you're a non-Christian. And being a non-Christian, you can't be bishop, you can't be king, right? In very similar ways. And similarly, the elites of the Jewish community are invited in by Christian rulers to be tax farmers, to be physicians, right? And to be catalysts for urban development. There is this idea of we want to invite Jews in, and if we conquer a city from the Muslims, we want to keep the Jews there because we believe, we the rulers, that despite the fact they don't go to church and despite the fact they're not of our religion, they are an urban community that can help in urban development, and that helps me as the Lord of this community. Whether they were welcomed by their peers within the Christian community, the farmers and the merchants, that's a different story. And in fact, we begin to see tensions of horizontal tensions between Jews and Christian neighbors because the Jews have these vertical ties with their rulers. You're the teacher's pet, right? You're protected by the Lord. Why should you be protected? You're not even Christian. Why should you get a better tax break than I do, right? And very often tax exemptions are offered to Jews in order to attract them. It's not a permanent, but 3-year, 5-year tax break to attract Jews to your city, to help as urban catalysts. If you're Christians living in the city and you're working to be an urban catalyst and you're not getting a tax break, that doesn't play well. So we have this odd relationship with Jews being protected by kings and bishops and lords, not because they're pro-Jews, right? Not because they're more evolved people, but because it benefits them. And we have an upset and a disconnect with their Christian peers, not because these Christian peers are necessarily anti-Semitic, because they're rivals with these people. They're political rivals, they're social rivals, they're economic rivals. And why should their rivals get a benefit? And this begins to happen, this sort of dual relationship of the Jews with their Christian neighbors begins to happen around this time as Christian Spain is expanding. Their cities are developing. We're getting urbanization during this period. And the Reconquest is beginning. The Almohads are beginning to be pushed out. The successor states, these Taifa states, are being conquered one after the other. So certainly by the mid-13th century, most of the Iberian Peninsula is now in Christian hands. And these expanding Christian Reconquest kings are using the Jews economically, and they're using them politically to bolster their own power, which does not play very well with the Christian street, we might say, at the time.
Now, also, for differences, I mean, the culture between between Christian and Muslim Spain, it does differ, right? This poetry is not going on in Christian Spain and other differences, right?
So at this period, right, you might say that there's a 2-century lag in many ways. The sorts of cultural flourishing that takes place around the year 1000 in Muslim Spain won't take place for a few more centuries at the great courts of the Christian kings. It does. Philosophy, copying of books, poetry, the birth of humanism, really by the 15th century, really does begin to happen in the Christian North. There are a few centuries behind in that arc. And certainly when things are booming in the 14th and 15th century in Christian Spain, they are decidedly not booming in the Kingdom of Granada, the one last holdout of Muslim power in the south. So it's sort of a rise and fall of culture in both areas. But the Jews who come from the south and resettle in the north see the Jews there as a little backward, right? Certainly if you're a poet and you're used to having patrons who will pay you to full-time write poetry, right? Or even part-time write poetry, and you don't have patrons in the north, your attitude is, oh, these guys are barbarians, right? They don't even recognize me as a great poet. They won't even underwrite me as a poet. And the Jews living in the north don't really take well to be called barbarians. They don't want to be seen as lesser Jews just because they don't write courtly poetry. They think their culture is quite strong. They have a dedication to studying Talmud and to studying philosophy in their own way, that they don't want to be called second-class Jews by these Jewish immigrants from the south. And there's some tension there.
Sure, and there are a number of famous, very, very famous today rabbinic figures in this Christian Spain. I'll mention there's the Meir Halevi Abulafia, the Ramaz, they call him, the Ramban, of course, Moshe ben Nachmanides, he is there, and his students, the Rashba, some even Adret or Aderet, right, or the Ritva, as those familiar. So there are many more. There are a number of very, very famous rabbinic figures in Christian Spain.
In the 13th century, the ones you're talking about in Toledo and Barcelona become very quickly major centers, not only in Spain, in the Jewish world. Like Nachmanides is an international grand figure in the Jewish world in the 13th century, as is Abulafia in Toledo. So with perhaps the exception of poetry and grammar, there are books of poetry and grammar that are being copied and commented on in the North, it doesn't quite in the 13th century reach to the position it had in the 11th and 12th century in the South. But certainly when it comes to a variety of areas, including mysticism, it seems that the North outstrips the South. It outstrips the Muslim world. And mysticism is one of the interesting cases. Mysticism is always there in Jewish life, right? There's not a period where we can go back far enough where it doesn't seem some element of what we call mysticism isn't there. But a particular type of theurgic mysticism, of this idea that human events are somehow connected to events in the upper world, that begins to spread in a serious way in Spain and southern France around this time, in the 12th and 13th century. And major Kabbalistic circles are established in Girona, in Barcelona, and in Toledo and the surrounding areas in the 13th century. And by the end of the 13th century, in the 1290s, we see the first appearance of something we're later going to call the Sefer HaZohar. It's a book, like many medieval books, that isn't published in final form. It gets added to, it gets shaped, it gets commented on. But people start talking about this book, the Book of Splendor, the Sefer HaZohar, in the 1290s in Castile as a product of this culture that's very interested in mysticism.
Sure, there are a lot of famous Kabbalim there, Moshe de Leon, there's Ramban, as you mentioned, there's and many countless others in this part of Spain. So, we can mention many more, and then there are more rabbinic figures, obviously the Ran, Rabbeinu Nissim, who's in the 14th century, right? There's just many, there's going to be many figures in these areas, and I'm sure I'm blanking and forgetting a number of others as well. And you mentioned they become international figures. The Rajba has like the largest responsa collection that we have of anybody in the period from all over the world. I mean, he's just thousands. Which we still have today. But what about how was the life in Christian Spain how are the communities organized? And what about the quote unquote, do we know the quote unquote regular people in the community there? Did that differ? I know we discussed Muslim Spain earlier. Did this differ in Christian Spain?
We have a lot more information about Christian Spain than we do about Muslim Spain. Muslim Spain, it was really, we know about some of the famous guys, and we sort of intuit that the ones we don't hear about perhaps not as famous, right? We know that there are these long distance merchants who are trading with Egypt. We know that there can't be everyone in the community is a long distance merchant. And so we have a little bit of that repeating itself in the north. What we begin to have is communities that are a little bit more modeled after Christian communities, which is to say you'll have a governing board sometimes modeled after municipal governing boards in Aragon, let's say. So the Jews living in Saragossa will say, well, the city in which we live has a governing board, and they serve a certain amount of years in terms. Certainly halakha allows for that. We talk about the halakhic ideal of having a governing board of officials along with a scholar or rabbi who is going to help guide them in their decision and inform them in matters of law. Some of these communities have rabbis. Some of them make use of rabbis as consultants. Some of them don't. But we begin to see the emergence of great families who generation after generation are running the cities of Barcelona, of Toledo, of Girona, of Saragossa. And so we see some tensions among those Jews who say, hey, wait a minute. There's nothing in Jewish law that says these 5 families can run things and that my family can't. And so there is this push by the disenfranchised Jews to have a greater say in Jewish self-government. There's a push by poor Jews to be represented. Okay, so I'm a poor Jew. Why should that mean that I don't get equal say in my community? You can imagine the answer to that. The rich Jews say, we're the ones who actually pay more taxes. We're the ones the community depends on. You wouldn't have a synagogue building if it wasn't for my family. So you guys should just follow my lead. And there's definite tensions across rival family lines. Think of like the Montagues and the Capulets, but in a Jewish mold. There's tensions between classes, what they call very often the mano mayor and the mano menor, the upper hand and the lower hand, the upper classes and the lower classes, over who should represent what. And we see a lot of these wealthy families constantly writing to the king to say, hey, can you give me a letter that says I have the right to do whatever I want and I can beat up on these other Jews? And very often the king, who likes a centralized government, right? That's what he's got, supporting a version of that in the Jewish community. So the Jewish leaders are very often in league with Christian leaders to strengthen their authority like an iron fist over other Jews. And that doesn't always play well with their Jewish friends and neighbors.
Yeah, understandably so. And a number of this and a number of other topics you discussed in your book, The Sephardic Frontier, right? Where you discuss communal tensions, the question of Jewish autonomy, Jewish communal organizations and authority, royal authority, and the legal status of Iberian Jewry. I'm reading some of the the chapters for the listeners. Maintenance and social boundaries on the Iberian frontier, and there's more. So this is discussed in that book. You do discuss a number of these questions and themes. Like I said, using these. So in the sources you use, there are chuvas. You have and are there other Spanish sources that you use as well there?
Sure, we have all these letters written by the king, the queen, the king's brother to these Jews. Thank you for your letter saying you want me to strengthen your hand against your Jewish enemies. Here's my response. So we have a lot of that correspondence. I think it's very common for Jews looking at the past to say, or non-Jews looking at the Jewish past, where did the Jews have it good? Where did they have it bad? Who were the nice people to the Jews? Who were the not? Where was it good for the Jews here, etc.? If you begin to read this documentation, you realize those were not questions Jews asked a lot. They would ask, are we in an Almohad situation? Like, is it so bad we got to leave? Yes. But after that, do we have a settlement charter? Are they allowing us to live? And we have a set of rules of how much we have to pay to get along. After that, there really is less concern with what the Christians or Muslims think. The assumption is the Christians don't really like us and the Muslims don't really like us. Most of their interest, most of their life is spent with other Jews. And we forget that Jewish tension is much more of a daily life problem than Christian Jewish tension and Muslim Jewish tension. And we can get somewhat, as moderns, fixated on these grand moments of expulsion, of attack that happen every once in a while because they are grand moments and they demand our attention. But if you want to know what life was like on a daily basis, it was husbands and wives sometimes working together, sometimes plotting against each other, the wife threatening to go back to her father if the husband doesn't do what she wants, right? We see rival Jewish families hiring Christian thugs to intimidate their Jewish rivals. Like, Jews thought about and cared about and rivaled with and partnered with Jews more than they did really with people outside the Jewish community.
For sure. And we've mentioned some of the rabbinic figures, the yeshivas, the learning that was going on, and then in the poetry and the philosophy and all the different famous works that we still have today and we're still read today and learned today that they worked on. So, and like you said, we get fixated, especially in Spanish Jewry. You mentioned Sfarad and Spain, and it's like, the expulsion in 1492 and the Inquisition. And maybe if someone knows, we won't discuss in this episode, but 1391, the rights of Castile. People don't, what we've been discussing today is usually not what's discussed or what's well known. I'm sure some listeners will disagree, but I mean, in general, not as well known. It's not what comes to mind when you mention Spain. It's always 1492.
Right.
That's what
No one in 1292 sat there going, I'd better get all my debts collected today because 200 years from now it's going to get ugly, right? You go out to collect your debts or you go out to sell your wares because it's Wednesday and that's what you're doing.
Exactly. So let's just mention here the Reconquista. So we've kind of mentioned it here. So then what happens? We mentioned it, but just to emphasize, especially for the Jews, now that we're discussing the Jews in Christian Spain, as they come and they conquer the Muslim part of Spain, what is that reintegration like? What is, you mentioned it before, whatever from their end, how when these, just to emphasize, when those Jews from the Muslim lands come in and they all kind of meld together, the communities.
Right. So we imagine that there is tension on every level of the community, right? How do we bring these Jews in, integrate them without having them change our community? Now, you can imagine there's 100 Jews in a particular place. Then 200 Jews who speak a different language show up. How do you still say this is the Jewish community of Barcelona and not the Jewish community of Cordoba reborn here in Barcelona, right? How are we still keep control when a larger immigrant group is coming in? So that's going to be an area of tension in some places. The Jews begin to eventually acclimatize to the new area. They speak the local language. Some of their scholars hold on to Arabic because they believe that Arabic is a language of power and knowledge, and they can get jobs in the Spanish colonial administration because they can draw up treaties with the Muslims and to translate things, etc. But for the most part, within a few generations, the Andalusi Jews integrate into the Christian world and become part of that world. On the intellectual level, it's not so easy. So there are people who say, look, I grew up in the Muslim South, and we cared about poetry, and we cared about, maybe a certain type of Pshat-inspired Talmudic commentary. We care about halakha for its own sake, rather not for its own sake, but for applied legal reasons. We don't want to talk about theoretical halakha. We want to talk about applied halakha. And they come into communities where there's an influence from northern France. There's an influence from the Tosafists. There's an influence in this idea of, no, we want to talk about Talmud really as an intellectual exercise. And we want to talk about drash and other parts of commentaries here. We want to look at the Bible and the Talmud together. And which group is going to hold sway? It's not, well, we really respect the way you do things in the mold of Rashi, and we really respect the way we do things in the mold of Al-Andalus, and let's all get together. That's not the way it plays out. Usually it's my way is better than your way, and there are extended controversies that take place in the 13th century over that. Much of it is over the writings of Maimonides. So even though he moves to Egypt, Maimonides' works reach Europe. They get translated, as you note, by the Ibn Tibbon family in southern France. And a lot of his take on philosophy is seen as a little bit foreign to some of these communities who did not grow up in Al-Andalus, where philosophy was perhaps woven into the curriculum more naturally. And so there are people who start to say, we ban the writings of philosophy. We don't want our children reading philosophy. And we banned the writings of Maimonides. There are people like Nachmanides who say, look, I happen to lean in many ways towards Rashi and towards the Tosafists, but you can't ban Rambam. That's a bridge too far. Like, say what you want about the guy. He's done nothing but try to protect the Jewish tradition. You're treating him like he's an enemy here. I can't have that. And so these dividing lines happen between people who think Andalusi heritage has to be respected at all costs, and Maimonides in particular, and those people who say, I don't know who this Aristotle guy is, but he's not in my Talmud, and I don't want to talk about it.
And that's a key point when we're discussing here the different figures coming from, because they were from different cultures. I mean, right. It's important to emphasize for listeners. People think today, well, there's Spain and the Spanish Jewry. But as we've discussed this whole episode, that's not the case. That wasn't the case. It wasn't the case until 1492 when they were kicked out when it was one Spain. So that's not what happened. And that's why there was these competing cultures and then these competing ideals and ideologies going on.
Right. And you look, in any Jewish community, even if you all grew up in the same town with the same language, there's going to be machlokets that come up. There's going to be, I don't follow that Rav. I'm stomping out of the yeshiva and forming my own, right? That happens anyway. Now you have a group who say, I literally don't speak your language. And I don't dress like you. And I've never met you. Now what? It becomes even harder for them to respect and integrate each other's traditions. But eventually, and this is part of the fascinating part of the story, they do. Figures like Rashba and figures like Nachmanides work very hard to not cross a line where they're completely turning their back on each other, right? We're going to try as best we can to integrate the best of Maimonides and the best of Rashi and the Tosafists into the same yeshiva. It doesn't happen easily. This Maimonidean controversy rises up again in the 14th century, but by the end of it all, we have a group that draws on the Zohar, it draws on Andalusi poetry and grammar, it draws on Alfasi, it draws on Rashi all at the same time. And if by 1492 you go to a Spanish yeshiva, you would be expected to be exposed to all of this.
So just one other thing, like I said, we're not going to go until later on. The part that I guess people the parts that are more famous, that listeners, people may be more familiar with, which is 1391. We'll have an episode or two on that. The riots in there, and then the Inquisition, the establishment of the Inquisition with the new Jews, conversos, moranos, whatever you want to call them, crypto Jews, and then with 1492 and expulsion and post-expulsion, which, like I said, you've written a book on, so hopefully we'll have another episode on that to discuss that. But there is one other event that we didn't discuss that I guess is famous, which is the disputation in Barcelona in 1263 with the Ramban. Nachmanides, you can still actually read it, right? It's been printed, the Vikuach, it's in the Kisvei Ramban, the 2 volumes, Mosadav Kook, edited by Chevelle. So talk a little bit about that and what was going on and what happened there, I guess, as the last thing for this episode.
Good. So we mentioned a little bit that there is this tension between Jewish relationship to authority on the one hand in the Christian world and Jewish relationship to their Christian neighbors. Over the course of the 13th century, we do see the beginnings of a push throughout the Christian world, which arrives in Spain as well, to put the Jews in their place, so to speak. Sort of an anti-Jewish push, which begins to happen throughout the church, which is tied to a larger movement of Catholic reform that happens within the church. It's not just an anti-Jewish moment, but there's a movement from Rome outward to control, standardize, make more orthodox the Christian church. And that eventually leads to the question of, well, if we're going to bring Christians into line, what about the non-Christians living in our midst? And so there's an interest in missionizing to the Jews, preaching to them to get them to convert. There's a greater condemnation of the Jews that shows up in different literature. And part of this wave of interest in the Jews and possibly bringing them into the Christian fold comes up in a couple major disputations. A disputation is like a public debate that's really a public intellectual joust, right? It's done in front of a large number. There can be debates between scholars writing back and forth, but this is live, it's public, it's funded, right? They sell food, right? It's a big spectacle. One takes place in Paris in the 1240s, the Disputation of Paris. One in the 1260s, as you say, 1263 in Barcelona. You mentioned Nachmanides was the disputant from the Jewish side. He does not want to do this. This is a command performance, right? He is aware all the Jews who participate in this thing, they're not saying, let me at them, I'm going to show those Christians what's what. They're saying, please, God, please, I'll call in sick. Please don't make me go, because there's no way you win. As a Jew, there's no way you're going to be crowned the winner ever. If you can fight to a draw and not have any rioting, that's what a win looks like. And so there is this push by the Christians to argue and use scholastic methods of logic and reasoning to prove to the Jews they are wrong and Christianity is correct. One of the pushes here is the argument that Jewish texts themselves admit that the Messiah has already come. If that's true, if the Messiah has already come, the Christians win the debate because there is no other Messiah in the Christian mind other than their Messiah, other than Jesus. So if we can see that some Jewish texts mention the Messiah in the past tense, they must be arguing that they know that Christ is the Messiah. Nachmanides does everything he can to bring nuance to this and say that's not what the texts are saying. Jews don't believe that their texts actually prove the truth of Christianity, but it's somewhat of a losing battle.
Right. And that's, for the Disputation of 1240, I did an episode with Robert Chazen. People can check that out if they haven't. And like I said, with the 1260, you can actually read it. So it's been published and they kind of from Man's side, and you can read it from what he has to say. So I guess that's it for this episode. We'll, like I said, hopefully pick up, and there'll be another number of other episodes in this series, and we'll discuss another episode post-expulsion. So what about suggested reading? Listeners interested in reading more. I mentioned your forthcoming book with Penn University Press called Jewish Life in Medieval Spain and New History. There's the old classic book by Jane Gerber, The Jews of Spain, History of the Sephardic Experience. What else can you mention?
So Yom Tov Assis, of now a blessed memory, wrote a great deal on the Jews of the Crown of Aragon. He has a book called The Golden Age of Aragonese Jewry, which is a classic. Mark Meyerson, a very fine scholar of the University of Toronto, has written several books. One that might be of interest is A Jewish Renaissance in Christian Spain, where he takes on this idea that there wasn't a clear path to expulsion, that Jewish life did flourish in some parts of the peninsula, even up to the eve of expulsion, which is a very fun book. Maya Soifer Irish also has a book on Jewish life in northern Castile in the period that we're talking about here, as these Jews are major catalysts for urbanization, and particularly it's something we only touched on a little bit, which is in money lending, that Jews become an important part of the business of credit. And that's one of the things that helps Spain rise as a major kingdom, as a major set of kingdoms. And the Jews play an important role of that, but one that costs them with their relations with their Christian neighbors and debtors. So she has some interesting work on that.
Correct. And I'll link to all these books, as well as, like I said, Jane Gerber's book, your book, The Sephardic Frontier, which discusses a lot of what we discussed. There's a lot more that's related that we didn't get to, like I said, money lending, I think you discussed in there as well. And also your new book, your forthcoming book, I'll put a link. It's on Penn Press's site. We'll see exactly when this podcast come out. We recorded it before, but that'll be linked as well. So listeners can check all that out. So with that, thank you very much, Professor Ray, for joining me.
Thanks, Naki. This was fun.